Monsignor Santino Barcillo closed the door and locked it with a sigh of relief. Laris Davna, the realtor, had brought the key codes after recording the receipt. It had been kind of her to come, but she had managed to outstay her welcome. While not quite making advances, she probed around the edges of his vocation as a priest before accepting his firm remonstrations that he was weary and wanted to unpack some things before retiring. It was a small lie, and he would say penance for it later. Still, Davna had sniffed in a rather charmless way before departing. She was a woman who seemed dissatisfied with life, though doubtless she had never been less than relatively comfortable. It seemed late in her years to develop the concept of making herself endearing when money was at stake. Perhaps that was uncharitable. He had taken great delight in meeting the crew of the ship that brought him to Shill. It was a modest ship with 8 Shovanti and 3 Rakiri, and they had been delightful company. She had been somewhat pushy, but as a realtor, perhaps it was merely an unflattering function of her work. Alone now, he looked at the tangled growth in the center atrium. Of all the faiths on the mission, the Buddhists had done the most to embrace alien faiths. He devoutly hoped the Buddhist contingent would enjoy the space. Bhikkhu Somdet and Bhikkhuni Aya were delightful people, and while others might cover the space, the pair asked for little. The Rakiri found Tibet delightful, and with Chinese control removed, the Dalai Lama had returned home to Lhasa. After his passing, the governess continued her work with the Panchen Lama, and over time, the Buddhists had bridged gaps of faith and understanding that was the quiet envy of most. For the moment, the vast complex was silent. It humbled him to think this place might serve as a beacon of hope for all faiths, far from home in this alien world. The spirit moved him, and he paused at the central conference hall to swipe up the lights, lost in profound wonder at the solitude. The building was nothing like a church, yet the alien architecture flowed with long, elegant archways that Wakama had said were welcome. He knew little about the race, but there was a majesty of presence in the way the building seemed to reach out to draw in the light. The imams would certainly prefer the Eastern Hall. While the question of prayer in space had been settled many years before, the issue of a different solar system entirely had led to spirited discussion. Given the problems of celestial mechanics, the conclusion was to use what served as a planet's location for 21 degrees north and 39 degrees east. A representation of Mecca in the minds of the faithful, the East Hall was best aligned for the purpose. These grounds would not be consecrated. He had no authority as a bishop. All things would come with time. Still, the moment moved him, and he felt the spirit of it. Truly, the divine transcended the boundaries of mortal understanding. In time, there would be proper appointments and fixtures, but for now, the space was largely empty. The building's years of disuse showing in the odd detritus and the odd furnishings that seemed to litter the space. There was no altar, only the open stage, but it would serve. "Where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there I am," he whispered, returning to his beloved Italian. Alone on an alien world, one could suffice. Surely the Lord would understand. He turned the chair toward the platform, and trying not to mutter at his aging knees, he knelt. His journey across the stars to reach this distant soil was not merely about teaching, but also about learning. There was so much more to know, expanding his understanding of God in this vastness of creation. Holy Writ had seen changes in the wake of the Shovanti, and yet while faith stretched and strained in understanding, faith also managed. If this ground was unconsecrated, still he could offer his consecration of self. He had thought so many times of what to offer during the journey. Now, alone, the prayer came to his lips. Even if there was no one to share it with, he was sharing it with God. "O Mary, Virgin most powerful and Mother of mercy, Queen of heaven and refuge of sinners, I consecrate myself to thine immaculate heart." Barcillo whispered the words. The Marian consecrations were something that resonated well with the Shovanti, but at the moment, these words were for him alone. "I consecrate to thee my very being and my whole life, all that I have, all that I love, and all that I am. To thee I give my body, my heart, and my soul. To thee I give my home, my life, my devotion. I desire that all that is in me and around me may belong to thee, and make share in the benefits of thy motherly benediction. And that this act of consecration may be truly efficacious and lasting, I renew this day at thy feet the promise of Holy Communion. I pledge myself to profess courageously and at all times the truth of my faith, and to live as befits my submission to the directions of the Pope, to pledge myself to keep the commandments of God and his Church, and to keep holy the Lord's Day, and to make the practice of Holy Communion integral to my life, so far as I be able to do so. Finally, I promise thee, O glorious Mother of God, to devote myself wholeheartedly to thy service, in order to hasten and assure the coming of the Sacred Heart in all the world, and in these heavens. What brave new world indeed, and how ineffable thy plan, that you have brought me here. Amen. It was a moment to cherish the divine, letting the silence sanctify it in his heart. Tomorrow would be the time for problems, sorting out furnishings, sending for the first cargo containers, the hiring of contractors, and the endless mundane tasks, none of which would be finished by the time the others arrived. But this time was his alone. Surely these times tried the faithful, shaken so badly by the certainty of the Imperium. There could be no doubt that the Shuvanti were devout. According to many, while the Rakiri faith was poorly understood, they possessed a quiet resolve that could move mountains. Little wonder that when faced with the Imperium and the vast diversity of its beliefs, convictions had been shaken. Il più grande traversare è vostro servitore. Perché ci se assalta sarà umiliato, ci si umilia sarà esaustato, he grumbled, taking refuge in the book of Matthew, while devoutly hoping this was a righteous act and he would find his place within it. Jesus has cursed the hypocrisy of false prophets, but surely he had not meant to use the onset of arthritis. And perhaps something might be done, when the time allowed. There had never been time on Earth, but Lady Wakama might know a capable doctor. Meanwhile, there was much to be done. Not to stand in prideful contest, but to learn and share, and through understanding restore heart to the faithful. If so many faiths of Earth could come together in that singular quest, surely it was possible. Even in the depths of blackest space, surely there was always hope.
This is hopeless, Marraket said flatly. The Sholvanti are not credulous enough to believe I am there to represent Duchess Eliana. Be brave, Sunchaser chortled. The universe is not hateful, neither is it easy, and the Sholvanti walk around wearing blinders half the time. It's amazing they aren't always bumping into things. You'd throw the first Kahachakt at me?
Marraket regarded her friend balefully. There was a time for optimism. It was best saved for when your enemy was being placed on the dinner table, or the wrong side of an airlock.
What about the second? Be wise. This plan has nothing holding it together but the Duchess's invitation. What if she asks about it? Then I'll be clever, Sunchaser said, breezily invoking the third Kahachakt. Anyway, it's not like she goes out. It's 1,000 to 1 against. Easy odds.
She was the Pathfinder, but her words felt a bit cavalier.
Be serious.
Marraket folded her arms. Invoking the fourth Kahachakt was usually meant to remind someone to keep their focus and their mind on their work. It mattered. Besides, she had the growing conviction Sunchaser was just trying to yank her a Syac, and such battles were not worth the aggravation. Sunchaser could frequently talk your ears off. In a Pathfinder, the trait was a positive boon. This felt more forced, though with Sunchaser that was only a guess. She had an easygoing manner at the best of times, while at the worst she could give someone an easygoing thump on the side of the head.
1,000 to 1 chances happen all the time.
Marraket reached out and picked through the bowl of nuts Sunchaser kept on her shelf, stalling for time. Getting light-fingered with the snacks was the fastest way to be put out the door, and she was rewarded with a grimace.
Parties aren't her thing, Sunchaser said with a hint of disapproval. We'll make sure she doesn't show up. It'll give Lavkia something to do.
She felt her Asaic twitch restlessly.
You aren't staying to monitor communications? How Dark Mother know? He's been wandering around this ship like a bad smell for the last week, and if I don't get out of here, I'm going to take a swipe at him.
Sunchaser shook her head.
Every morning, that's every morning of your entire life. It's fallen on me to organize this mob, cutting contracts and tending sick kids. I'm not missing this for anything. It's just a reconnaissance, she said defensively. Of one of the best defended estates on the planet,
Sunchaser cackled before dropping her voice, faking it as the galaxy's most discreet pathfinder. She didn't wear it well.
A recon? You don't believe that any more than I do, or you wouldn't be mobilizing the family. Whatever's going on, you're after more than just tracking that boy. It is possible we may learn something once he is out of the tide pool. With him or Zinshiki?
Sunchaser asked pointedly, sounding wise.
If your girl's there, best make sure she doesn't carry him off. With whatever presents itself, she replied tetchily.
In truth, either answer would suffice, but discovering the gaps in your information was the point of reconnaissance. Besides, the comment struck rather close to how she'd first mated with Lavkia, though the old pathfinder didn't know it. Probably.
That'll be just fine then. Eyes open, ears sharp.
Sunchaser groomed her Asaic carefully.
Just don't worry so much. We'll have a great time.
Something about the way she said it gave her pause.
What do you mean, we? You aren't going to work comms for the fire teams? Oh, Cracks and Shahs no. Raikishi can do that.
Sunchaser grinned unrepentantly.
I love you to death, but you can't bluff to save your life. Besides, you need someone with savoir-faire. Someone who can talk their way around these people.
Certainly fell like a lead meteor.
You want to come for the free food? That too.
Sunchaser's Asaic twitched happily.
What's the worst that could happen? A firefight with the palace guards? You worry too much. Sunchaser snorted dismissively. Anyway, they ought to be breaking out the quality booze, and anyone who dies with a drink in their hand dies happy.
It was possible that most pathfinders might say something like that, but Sunchaser had never actually tried putting it to the test. Probably.
Yo, what's Dad doing? Amy whispered. No clue, Dex said, staring as Daddy rocked back and forth. But he does it every time he has to go to work.
They all knew Daddy did things he couldn't tell them about. He'd ripped off that bandage a long time ago. They watched as Daddy rocked back and forth, singing in that strange language of his.
What are you?
Avi came in and shooed the killers away.
How'd you like it if somebody came and gawked at you in your private moments, huh? Shoo!
If Mum had a broom, she would have smacked them all with it. Dex had different ideas, though. When Mum was gone, he wandered outside. There was a time that Tom Steinberg would have downed a fifth of bottom shelf Oboroldo and spent all night with Avi before he had to go to work. Maybe it was age, and maybe it was the influence of a healthy, loving family, but that didn't cut it anymore. Instead, he prayed, and, well, praying made him feel far better than the drinking ever had. Drinking was relegated to celebrating after the fact, while quiet prayer became his foundation. Tom had even imported a talus and kippa for the occasion. Tom usually recited the vidui, the prayers for the dying. He figured that if something went wrong the day of, he wouldn't have time to say it, as he actually was dying. He knew God would understand. Avi and the pups would mourn in their fashion, and if there was no one to sit Shiva for him, God would still watch over them. Then again, his imported Jewish literature said that even if you weren't dying, it was good for your spiritual health. Sincerely repenting was a good thing to do, no matter what. He built up a lot of no matter what over the years, though life with Avi and the pups pushed the burden aside. Tom stood, reciting the first prayer. This first one acknowledged that his life was in God's hands, and that the speaker had sinned. That was the first step to repentance. Tom knew he was a bad man. He took no joy in any of the things he'd done, and on his worst days, he wished that things could have turned out differently. God saw the good in everybody, though. The prayer ended with a request that, should Tom die, it be an easy, peaceful passing. After that, Tom recited a number of psalms, 121, 130, 91, followed by Adon Olam. At this point, he had nothing but faith. All his skills were great, but everything failed eventually. If he had to die, he wasn't afraid. Everything died, a fact he knew all too well. He thought about his mother. He thought about Uncle Bill. Tom sighed and transitioned to Anabachoa and Va'al Ken Nekave. And therefore we hope to you, O Lord, our God, that we may speedily behold the splendor of your might. If it was Tom's time, he hoped that he would leave behind a better world, at the very least. A lot of the things he'd done, they'd been in response to some problem he'd tried to fix. He didn't want to go so far as to say people deserved what he had done to them, though. After all, who was he to judge? Only the Lord could judge. Only he could forgive. And finally, Tom recited the Shema. He covered his eyes as he said it, as was tradition. As he prayed, Tom just reflected. He was raising the kids as well as he could. If he wasn't there to watch over them, he just hoped they grew up the best they possibly could.
Daddy? What is this?
Tom snapped out of his thoughts and turned to Dex. Sorry, you startle me. What's up?
What were you doing?
From the look on Dex's face, Tom could tell his adopted son was trying to make sense of the weird clothes and singing in a language he'd never heard. He was more than happy to oblige. One of the rabbis, Tom forgot who, had a parable about 4 children. A real smart one, wicked yet simple. It was usually brought up around Passover, but the way Tom saw it, it was good to indulge their questions. Tell me about your customs concerning the Passover Seder was just as good a question as, what is this? Praying. As he said it, Tom had an idea. You were supposed to ask that your kids learn and follow the ways of the Torah, but he and Avi had decided to let the kids decide what was best for them. That being said, come with me. I want to show you something. He scooped up Dex and strode inside, stopping to grab a leather-bound book off the bookshelf. This is the Torah, Tom explained, as he sat in the armchair and positioned Dex on his lap. It's the laws and history of the Jewish people. He opened the book. Okay, technically it was Tanakh, but that included the books of the Torah, so Tom could explain the difference later.
What's a Jewish?
Tom chuckled. That's me, buddy. My people. And that means you too. Also, technically. He'd leave that for the rabbis to sort out. There was an age-old battle about who was actually Jewish and who wasn't. Even the Orthodoxy was split on the issue of aliens. But that wasn't the issue right now. For now, Tom and Dex just talked. He told him about God, the commandments, Israel, and the basic tenets of Judaism. And Dex ate it all up, asking question after question, as Tom told him stories about prophets and gods and kings. And when they were done, Tom closed the book and Dex hopped off his lap, and the little shark boy looked back at him.
Daddy?
Yeah? Tom put the Tanakh away.
Can we talk more about this when you come home?
Yeah. A tear came to Tom's eye as he smiled. As Dex ran off to rejoin Mum and his sisters, Tom just thought about God. He added one final prayer. It was a simple one. All he said was, "Thank you." Akurune looked around his room. It had never been particularly large, but he remembered the feeling of how sparse it was when he arrived. The walk-in closet that sheltered his wardrobe was larger than the area for his bed. It was there to be functional, to keep his tunics cleaned and pressed. to hold his styling table with his oversized mirrors and makeup kit, for storing his instruments, the place where he laboured to become what he was supposed to be for others every single day. It was a room for work, not for living. More like a hermitage under the strict ministrations of his mistress and mentor, Tranja. It was a place to recover, not to relax. Now it wasn't even that. A command performance at an imperial palace should have marked the start of a real career. Now he knew it for what it was. A final act. A bow before the curtain that was his life. Everything he sought ended here, in the boxes already packed to be shipped off to his father's estate. He'd been there. There'd been a summer once. Now, he couldn't even remember what it looked like. Mistress Tranja had been kind in her fashion. She'd given him the news in private, while away from the other initiates. It didn't matter. Word got around fast when someone was out. He wasn't the first. Of the 12 initiates he'd entered with, there were only 3 others left. He knew he'd pushed, but it wasn't easy being a man in a woman's world. No one would ever have noticed him if he'd blended into the crowd. That's what he'd told himself. Now all that was left was a change of clothes for the morning, and he kept back a pair of tight blue pants that looked close enough to human jeans to pass at a distance, and a dark leather jacket of immaculate, glossy Turox leather. It was beautifully tooled, with simple, elegant lines, draping over his hips to accentuate his body. Again, it wasn't human, but it would pass. Today was the last day he would wear the whites. He didn't know what to feel. Even the letter from his father had been unable to break through the numbness that suffused him. It was like the winter was reaching out to take him. His father sounded happy he was coming home, but when was the last time he'd written? Almost 3 years now. However effusive, his father's happiness couldn't touch him. There were still obligations, though. He'd practiced as hard as he could, even after the news. If anything, he'd pushed his voice to the limit, mastering the unfamiliar sounds of English, testing and retesting himself to capture the inflection and tones, to mimic the sounds perfectly, even when he still needed the translator. Freddie Mercury's voice was a thing of beauty, and while he could keep up, it took tremendous effort. But he was determined. If this was going to be his last performance, he'd make it his best. He'd leave the Enclave tomorrow, head held high. The other initiates would never see his tears. They weren't for them. The last few years, they'd made his life hell. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction. It won't be a say. She'll go next. Inchik and Persoon are a pair of self-absorbed bitches, but they'll fawn over each other until it comes down to just them. Then they'll tear each other to shreds. He'd cry tomorrow night, when no one could see. But first, he'd give a performance no one would forget. He didn't owe it to Tranja. He owed it to himself. He owed it to the music. But there were still obligations. Even more important than tomorrow's performance, the last he owed was to Caslin and Kamara. No one would ever see the gift they'd given him, but in the years to come, at least, he'd have that to treasure. It hadn't been a bribe, it had been a real present. Even after they'd met and discovered he wasn't a woman, they hadn't wanted anything from him. They treated him like a person. They were his friends. The only ones he had since Kalai was forced out of the program 2 years ago. He'd probably never see them again. In the meantime, he was still a cliff singer, even if it was for only one more day. Not even Mara and Lynn would see him hurt. He'd give them his best. They deserved that, and they deserved the truth. His hand trembled as he reached for his on-the-pad. They deserved to know. Not now, but he had the time to write something and save the draft. He'd send it tomorrow, when he was being whisked away, and maybe someday he'd have the nerve to reach out to them again. For now, even a goodbye should be done with style. "My dearest friends," he began, choking back the lump in his throat. He couldn't do this face to face. A text over the on-the-pad wouldn't let them hear his pain. "I am writing you to say goodbye. and while my heart is filled with pain in doing it, I know how lucky I am to have you both. I would not trade away a single moment of the joys you've both brought to me. I know how lucky I am to have someone in my life who makes saying goodbye so hard. Home from school, Sholea watched the afternoon sun slip toward the horizon. There was time. She cast aside her coat, pausing to raise the temperature in the house before padding barefoot toward the conservatory. That was one of her favourite rooms. While she wasn't as devout as her mother's, the room was just off the north side of the house, along the garden and the pool. Facing west, it offered an unobstructed view down the cliffs to the ocean beyond. After Amit and Chanda died, she mourned in her fashion. Shamanta worship demanded little, and after Mever took a position with the academy, the house stayed empty most of the week. After a few months, she cleared away the chairs that had filled the room, making the space her own. That was the thing about life returning to the house. After putting off clearing Chanda's room for so many years, she'd been able to get on with the task without pain. Tom had suffered through meeting her mother's without saying a word, but the idea of keeping him on the couch was impossible. Hopefully he'd stay with her and Miv in the central bedroom most of the time, but a man needed privacy now and then. Miv said he was still unpacking boxes at her apartment on campus. Unsettled in every sense, it would be good if they could make it feel like his home. There was also Deshin. It was a small house. If they took out an office, it would only have 5 proper bedrooms, but Armis would be just right for her. While the furniture was dated, they let her pick out something new. And there was still the other room, in case Tom's... well, whatever Zinchiki was to Tom, she'd have a place here when it was needed. It would seem like a crowd after all these years, but the idea was welcome. Well, except the loss of private time. All of that would change, but it was a change for the better. But the conservatory was hers. Slipping off her top, she pondered her last call with Miv. Something was going on, and it troubled her. Was Tom all right? Yes. Was Deshin doing well? Certainly. Would they be home this shell? That was where things took a turn. On the face of it, Tom was going to a function, and no, Miv wouldn't be accompanying him. Picking around the edges of that just took the papaya. Someone should be with Tom at this sort of thing, and while Miv protested it was a responsibility to the visiting humans, that really wasn't an answer. Tom joining Badin Dasari as a working host only made it worse. What sort of women organised a banquet with married men attending unaccompanied? Miv had gotten squeamish at that point, so she relented. But it didn't sit well. When they came home next shell, there would be a reckoning. Pursing her lips, she folded her top and laid it out. Shamatal was low on the horizon, but there was time. She hooked her thumbs into her slacks and pushed them down and tested the air. It was cool, but not cold, and the ventilation was bringing the room up to temperature. Prayer was a welcome relief, but freezing her tits off in a sunroom, gripped by the first winds of winter, was not for the faint of heart. Satisfied, she slid off her bra and panties before placing one foot into the room. The light of Shamantal fell over her, and she felt the goddess's warmth as she padded over to the thick rug she used for her devotions. Kneeling toward the horizon and settling back, she opened her palms and began. Shamantal, touch me. One day at a time, I come closer to destiny. Having spoken the words, she closed her eyes and opened her senses. To be naked was the only proper way to offer prayer to the goddess, to have no barriers between yourself and Shamantal's light. No trappings of finery or tokens of devotion were needed. They only stood in the way. Shamantal, see me, my life before you, as one beat of your heart. The life of the goddess was measured in eternity. Shamantal had shone upon shield before the first prayer was offered, patiently nurturing life. To bear yourself before her was to embrace the eternal, to be humbled by patience, yet know that your existence, however brief, was just as valid as the goddess. To see Shamantal's light was to be seen, that one could not be without the other. Shamantal, know me. Feel the strength of my love. like a rock in the sea. While she was here, she was here. She was a part of life's tapestry, and in that was validation. Before spaceflight, the earliest worshippers sailed their dead to the sunset in primitive boats, setting them ablaze before watching their loved ones join the goddess on the horizon. Ages had passed, and now the faithful sent their bodies into the heart of the star, embraced by Shamantal, and returning in her light. Shamantal, hear me. Alone in the multitude, my voice stands apart. The prayer was affirmation, not just of her being, but your own. When she'd asked, Tom had described a human prayer in disparaging terms, as asking things of divinity. The way he described it almost sounded like begging, and she dropped the matter after that. Tom had proven himself to her mothers, and to her. He believed in something. He had his convictions. He was a good man, and that was what mattered. Faith managed. She cast her eyes to the sea as Shamantal slipped to the horizon. It was a cloudless sky, and there was a final flash of green as Shamantal slipped down below the horizon. It was considered a final blessing, and she took a deep breath. The goddess would look down on her and hers, and tonight she would know peace. Though whatever was going on, there would still be a reckoning. The clam trap? Really? Desala looked around the seedy bar and stared at her blue grail with disdain. I know it's a service town, but isn't there a better bar somewhere else? It was only 7 of them. The twins stayed on campus to help the painters get ready for their big day, or something. Lark had begged off, working a tight deadline for the student vlog with Bree. Sephir hung out with them for a bit, but she didn't drink, and had headed back with Belder and Pris after the first round. That left Jaxmi trying to catch the bartender's eye while Desala grumbled. Letzi, Nessa and Melondi were having a good time, while Zinshiki sat nursing something she called a bloodshot. It was just as well the bartender knew how to make one, since it gave the Petra girls something to do. Desi was fast asleep and snoring, and without the Petra wedging her in, Desi might have fallen out of the booth. Jaxmi wandered over to get refills, giving the bartender a cheeky grin, but the old biddy slouched off to serve the other end of the counter. Desala had a point. The clam trap really was a dive. Still, with Melondi's security pod loitering around, how bad could it be? Well, aside from the service. Even on ice, the blue grail was a little off, and yeah, it was kind of a rough crowd. They didn't really fit in with their school uniforms, but how bad could it... Fuck! Who let these academy bitches in? Jaxmi turned around at the sound of the voice. A group of locals were gathered around the table. They looked like marine cast-offs, working women with a lot of muscle, big tits, and not much between the ears. The largest of them was leaning over the table with her knuckles planted while Melondi shook her head. What? Little rich girl doesn't want to give it back? That was the loud bitch, and she had 4 partners standing around egging her on. It almost felt like a cliché, but the local service towns had an uneasy relationship with the academy. The school gave the towns a reason to exist, but the campus was private, and some of the locals had resentments. She probably thought Melondi was shaking her head in fear. Jax knew Mel was warning off the death's heads, and she wandered back, hoping one more body might stall the locals long enough that someone would have some sense. She was close enough to hear Zinshiki ask Mel, I have the writ for 3 more days. Good for anything, Melondi whispered, with a nearly imperceptible shrug. But there are 5 of them. Are you sure about this? The Petrin girl glanced over at Desala and Letzi. Like we practiced then. The local must have not liked being talked about. Flexing her bust, she pulled a knife and jabbed it into the table. Desala looked at it as she slid out of the booth, with Letzi slipping up behind her. What's that? Thought you prissy bitches were smart. The local girl yanked it up. It's a knife. While Melondi's commanders looked ready to draw down, but they seemed farther away all of a sudden. You call that a knife? I've seen bigger toothpicks, Desala flounced. It was one of her best, as she flipped her hair over one shoulder before taking Letzi by the wrist. "Come on, Letz, we're getting out of here. I mean, seriously, I'm not going to waste my time with this Turok shit." She was halfway to the door and muttering all the way, "They call this a bar? It's embarrassing. What a fucking waste of my time." Jax grinned disarmingly as one of the other locals eyed her up. She slipped back into the booth, hoping a show of solidarity would help. Big Tits only leered down as Desala and Letzi walk out the door, jutting her tusks at the girls as Desi continued to snore. "You prissy bitches don't belong in our place. That one can't even hold her grail."
"My sister has been keeping late hours this week."
Zinshiki slid out of the booth and stood up. Face to face, the top of her head barely came to the local girl's chin.
"You should honor the 8th Kakachat and leave."
"Oh, your pet speaks," Big Tits guffawed, flipping the blade up in her hand. "Your buddies had the sense to leave. Now I'm going to cut you up, Fuzzy."
"You wanted to sit in the booth and have drinks?"
Zinshiki looked up at the woman towering over her. She took another sip from her glass before tossing the drink in Big Tits' face.
"Have mine."
Jaxme didn't know what was in a bloodshot, but it smelled caustic, and she'd entertained doubts it might kill you to drink it. Whatever it was, the woman screamed, dropping the knife to claw at her eyes. Jaxme had a sinking feeling this was going to go badly, but from her seat in the booth she had a good view, as Desala and Letzi slipped back inside. They had rocks. "You should leave, now. Zinshiki is a Pezrin. They're from the Alliance," Mel said patiently. For all the galaxy, she sounded just like Professor Warwick explaining some obscure human idiom. "They're not picky eaters, which is the only reason she's let you on her menu." Big Tits had finished clawing at her eyes and was bending down to pick up her knife.
"We're going to fuck you up."
From the look on her face, she planned to enjoy it. "Say hello to our little friend," Melondi smiled archly. Desala Serhart was 6'7" and a star of the diving team. Letzi was 6'5", but then it didn't really matter. Their swings connected and blood flew. The two careened into the pair in front of them and the others turned in surprise. That was when Zinshiki moved. Big Tits was moving sluggishly as the Pezrin leapt and swarmed up her body. Something happened. Jax couldn't really see, but Big Tits was howling in pain, and as she tried to pull Zinshiki off as the Pezrin leapt down by the table and bared her fangs. Desala and Letzi moved in. Desala jabbed one in the sternum before finishing her off, while Letzi clubbed the other in the head. Zinshiki moved in and stomped down hard. Big Tits howled again, but stayed on the floor. Jaxme leaned out to survey the damage. "Grab your drinks, I'll pay the bartender, then let's get out of here." It was a moot point since one of Mel's commandos was already having an earnest discussion with the old biddy behind the bar, but there was a time for credits to do the talking. It paid to be a good tipper. Desi groaned and looked around.
"What's going on?"
Zinshiki felt a deep and abiding contentment that bordered on the religious. Surely Sunchaser would have approved. If she had been tricked into her oath watching over Melondi, perhaps it was not all bad. The Dark Mother's ways were her own. It was best to hold on to the 20 Kahachakt and leave interpretations to the elders. At least she has something to show for it.
"Oh my goddess! Is there an ear in my drink?"
Desi whispered, staring in horror at her cup. She looked ready to throw it away, but Shorvanti was slow. Zinshiki slipped it from her hand and cradled it to her.
"Mine,"
she said tartly, glaring at Desi. Perhaps they qualified as sisters. Certainly she was not going to let anyone else kill her. It was not done. Anyway, it was only ice and a little blue grail. Kept cold, her prize was certainly not spoiled before she got to the mini-fridge in her room. The Dark Mother was gracious. It would be a perfect courtship gift for past.